My daughter announced at Thanksgiving that her stepfather was her real dad now, so I agreed and let her find out the difference. The words came out of nowhere during dessert while I was cutting into pumpkin pie. My daughter Natalie stood up at the table in front of my parents, my sister's family, and my ex-wife's smug new husband, and announced that she wanted everyone to know that Derek was her real dad now. Not me, Derek. Because Derek actually cared about her future and wanted her to succeed, while I just wanted to keep her small and limited. She was 14 years old, and she delivered this speech like she'd rehearsed it, her voice steady and confident, her eyes meeting mine with a challenge I'd never seen before. My mother gasped. My father's fork clattered against his plate. Derek sat there with this careful expression of surprise that didn't reach his eyes, and I knew immediately he'd planted every word. I set down my knife and asked Natalie if that was really how she felt. She said yes, absolutely, and she'd been thinking about it for months. Derek understood her in ways I never had. Derek supported her dreams instead of crushing them with negativity and doubt. Derek treated her like an adult capable of making her own decisions instead of a child who needed constant supervision. She said she wanted to change her last name to match Derek's, and she wanted to live with him and her mother full-time instead of splitting custody. She wanted me to understand that this wasn't about me being a bad person, but about Derek being a better father than I could ever be. The dining room went silent, except for the sound of my nephew crying in the background, because the tension had frightened him. I looked at my ex-wife Vanessa sitting next to Derek, with her hand over her mouth like she was shocked by this announcement. But her eyes told a different story. She'd known this was coming. She'd probably helped Natalie craft the speech. Vanessa had always been ambitious and strategic, and when she'd left me 3 years ago for Derek, a financial advisor who made 4 times my salary, she'd framed it as personal growth and finding her authentic self. The divorce had been brutal, but we'd settled on joint custody with Natalie spending weekdays with Vanessa and weekends with me. It had worked reasonably well until Derek proposed 6 months ago, and suddenly everything about my parenting became a problem that needed fixing. Derek finally spoke up and said he appreciated Natalie's feelings, but this was obviously a complicated situation that required careful discussion among all the adults. He said it with this patronizing tone that made my jaw clench. He added that he and Vanessa had been talking about what was best for Natalie's development, and they felt she needed more stability and focus as she approached high school. He said this while looking at me like I was the source of instability. My father stood up and said this conversation was inappropriate for Thanksgiving dinner, and maybe we should all take a break. Natalie said she didn't want a break. She wanted an answer. She wanted to know if I was going to fight her on this, or if I was going to respect her choice. I looked at my daughter standing there so certain and righteous, and I realized she had no idea what she was actually asking for. She thought Derek was better because he bought her expensive clothes and took her to fancy restaurants and never said no to anything she wanted. She thought I was limiting her because I enforced her curfew and made her work a part-time job to pay for her own phone and insisted she maintain a B average to keep her driving privileges. She'd grown up with 2 parents who loved her, but lived modestly, and now she'd gotten a taste of Derek's wealth and decided that was what real love looked like. She was 14, and she genuinely believed money equaled care and permissiveness equaled respect. I told Natalie that if she truly wanted to live with Derek and her mother full-time, then I wouldn't stop her. My mother started to protest, but I held up my hand. I said, if Natalie felt Derek was a better father, then she should have the opportunity to experience what that actually meant on a daily basis, instead of just on weekends and special occasions. I told her I loved her, and I'd always be her father whether she wanted me to be or not, but I wasn't going to force her to spend time with me if she didn't want to be there. Vanessa's face went pale, and Derek's expression shifted to something that looked almost like concern. Natalie looked confused, like she'd expected me to argue or fight or beg her to reconsider. When I just accepted her declaration, she didn't know what to do with it. My sister walked me outside after dinner and asked what the hell I was thinking. She said I couldn't actually let Natalie move in with Vanessa and Derek full-time based on a teenager's tantrum at Thanksgiving. I told her it wasn't a tantrum. It was a calculated manipulation that Derek had been orchestrating for months and Natalie had fallen for completely. My sister asked what I planned to accomplish by agreeing, and I said I planned to let reality teach Natalie what I apparently couldn't. She thought Derek was better because he was fun and rich and permissive. She needed to learn that parenting wasn't about being fun. It was about preparing your child for real life, even when they hated you for it. My sister said I was gambling with my relationship with my daughter, and I might lose. I told her I'd already lost her to Derek's manipulation, and this was the only way to win her back. Monday morning, I called my lawyer. Jeffrey had handled my divorce and had warned me back then that Vanessa would likely try to modify custody once she remarried. I explained what happened at Thanksgiving and said I wanted to file paperwork, giving Vanessa primary custody with me moving to alternating weekends and 1 weeknight dinner per month. Jeffrey asked if I'd lost my mind, and I said no, I'd found clarity. He argued that no judge would force me to give up custody, and I should fight this. I told him I wasn't giving up. I was implementing a strategy that required patience and documentation. He said he'd draft the papers, but he wanted it on record that he thought this was a terrible idea. I thanked him and hung up. Vanessa called me that evening and asked what I thought I was doing. She'd heard from Natalie that I'd agreed to the custody change, and she wanted to know what my angle was. I told her there was no angle. Natalie had made her preference clear, and I was respecting it. Vanessa said she knew me better than that, and I had to be planning something. I said the only thing I was planning was to step back and let her and Derek handle all the parenting responsibilities they'd convinced Natalie they were better equipped to manage. Vanessa went quiet, and then asked if this was some kind of punishment. I told her it was the opposite of punishment. It was giving them exactly what they'd asked for. She said we needed to discuss this in person, and I said we could discuss it through our lawyers. Then I hung up before she could respond. The custody modification went through faster than I expected, because I didn't contest anything. Within 3 weeks, Natalie had moved her things from my apartment to Vanessa and Derek's house, in the suburb where the country club families lived. She called me once during that transition to ask if I was mad at her, and I said no, I wasn't mad. I was just giving her space to figure things out. She said she still wanted to see me on weekends, and I reminded her that wasn't what she'd asked for at Thanksgiving. She'd said Derek was her real father now, and she wanted to live with them full time. I was honoring that choice. She got quiet and said she didn't mean she never wanted to see me, and I told her we'd follow whatever the custody agreement specified. Then I told her I loved her, and I'd talk to her soon, and ended the call before my voice could break. My apartment felt cavernous without Natalie's presence. Her room sat empty with the bed I'd built for her when she was 7, and the bookshelf we'd assembled together, and the desk where she'd done her homework while I cooked dinner. I'd painted the walls her favorite shade of blue and hung pictures of us at various ages, camping trips and birthday parties and ordinary moments that had meant everything. Now it was just a museum of a relationship that my daughter had decided to abandon for someone with a bigger house and looser rules. I left everything exactly as it was, because I knew I'd need it again. I just had to wait for Derek's mask to slip and for Natalie to see what was underneath. The first week I heard nothing from Natalie or Vanessa. The second week Natalie sent me a text saying she was settling in fine and her new room at Derek's house was amazing. She sent photos of a bedroom twice the size of her old one with a king bed, and a flat-screen TV, and a walk-in closet full of new clothes. The caption said Derek had taken her shopping because she needed a wardrobe appropriate for their lifestyle. I texted back that it looked nice, and I was glad she was happy. She responded with a thumbs-up emoji. No mention of missing me or wanting to visit, just documentation of her upgrade. Week 3, I got a call from Natalie's school. The attendance secretary said Natalie had been absent 4 times in the past 2 weeks, and tardy 6 times. They'd sent automated messages to Vanessa's number listed as primary contact, but hadn't received any response. They were calling me as secondary contact to see if I knew what was happening. I said I'd been unaware of the absences, and I'd follow up. The secretary said they appreciated it, and if the pattern continued, they'd need to schedule a meeting about truancy. I thanked her and immediately called Vanessa. She didn't answer, so I left a voicemail asking about Natalie's absences. 3 hours later, she texted back that Natalie had been sick and they'd kept her home. I texted back asking why the school hadn't been notified, and she said Derek had handled it, and there must have been a miscommunication. I called the school back and asked them to add me to all communications about Natalie's attendance and academic progress. The secretary said she'd update the records and suggested I check the parent portal online where they posted grades and assignments. I logged in that evening and discovered Natalie's grades had dropped significantly. She'd been a solid A and B student when she lived with me, but now she had 2 C's, a D, and an F in algebra, multiple missing assignments in every class, notes from teachers about incomplete work and lack of participation. I took screenshots of everything and saved them in a folder Jeffrey had told me to create. Then I texted Natalie and asked how school was going. She responded 6 hours later saying it was fine, and she had to go because Derek was taking her and Vanessa out for dinner. Week 5. I got a call from Natalie at 11 on a Friday night. She was crying and saying she needed me to come get her. I asked what was wrong and where she was, and she said she was at a party at someone's house, and things had gotten weird, and she wanted to leave. But Derek had taken her phone away earlier as punishment for something, and she'd borrowed someone else's phone to call me. My stomach dropped, and I asked for the address. She gave me a location in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, and I was in my car within 2 minutes. The drive took 20 minutes through empty streets, and when I arrived, I found a house full of teenagers and no adults in sight. Music pounded from inside, and kids were scattered across the lawn drinking and smoking. I found Natalie sitting on the curb in front of the house with her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up when I approached, and her makeup was smeared from crying. She stood and hugged me, and I could smell alcohol on her breath. I asked if she'd been drinking, and she admitted she'd had a few sips of something someone had given her, but she hadn't liked it. I asked whose party this was, and she said a junior from her school that she barely knew. I asked how she'd gotten here, and she said Derek had dropped her off because he thought it would be good for her to socialize with kids from the neighborhood. He'd said she needed to expand her social circle and make connections with people who could help her network in the future. I asked if he'd checked whose house this was, or if there would be adult supervision, and Natalie said he'd told her she was mature enough to handle herself at parties, and he trusted her judgment. I drove Natalie back to my apartment and made her drink water and eat crackers. She curled up on the couch and said Derek had been mad at her earlier because she'd talked back when he'd told her to clean her room. He'd taken her phone and said she needed to learn respect and gratitude for everything he was providing. Then he'd told her about the party and said it was a good opportunity for her to prove she could act like an adult. He'd dropped her off around 9 and told her to text him when she wanted to be picked up, but she didn't have her phone, so she couldn't text him. She'd tried to leave earlier but didn't know the area and was scared to walk home alone. So she'd borrowed a phone from a girl she met and called me instead because she knew I'd come get her. I asked if her mother knew where she was, and Natalie said Mom had been at some work event with Derek, and they probably weren't even home yet. I asked if Derek had checked with the party host's parents before dropping her off, and Natalie said she didn't think so. I told her to get some sleep and we'd figure things out in the morning. She asked if I was going to tell Mom and Derek, and I said absolutely I was. She started crying again and said Derek would be so mad and take away more privileges and make her life miserable. I asked if Derek had been making her life miserable in other ways, and she just shook her head and said she was tired, and could she sleep in her old room. I said of course, and tucked her into the bed I'd built for her when she was 7. Saturday morning I called Vanessa at 8. She answered sounding groggy and annoyed and asked what I wanted. I told her I had Natalie at my apartment because I'd picked her up from an unsupervised party Derek had dropped her off at last night. Vanessa's tone changed immediately, and she asked what I was talking about. I explained the entire situation, including the alcohol and the lack of adult supervision, and Derek taking Natalie's phone away before abandoning her at a stranger's house. Vanessa said that couldn't be right. Derek wouldn't do something so irresponsible. I told her to ask Derek himself, and she said she would, and she'd call me back. An hour later she called and said there had been a misunderstanding. Derek had thought the party was supervised, and he'd taken Natalie's phone because she'd been rude, but he'd planned to give it back before dropping her off and forgot. I asked how he'd expected her to contact him for pickup without a phone, and Vanessa didn't have an answer. I told Vanessa that I was documenting all of this, and if anything similar happened again, I'd be filing to modify custody back in my favor. She said I was overreacting and trying to sabotage their family. I said I was protecting my daughter from negligent supervision, and if she couldn't see how dangerous Derek's choices had been, then she was part of the problem. She hung up on me. Natalie spent the weekend at my apartment, and by Sunday evening she seemed more like herself. We made pancakes for breakfast and watched movies, and she did her homework at the kitchen table while I worked on my laptop nearby. She didn't mention wanting to go back to Derek's house. When Vanessa called Sunday evening and asked to speak to Natalie, I handed over my phone and listened to my daughter's side of the conversation. She told her mother she'd be ready to be picked up whenever, and yes, she was fine, and no, she didn't want to talk about the party anymore. After Vanessa picked Natalie up, I sat in the empty apartment and called Jeffrey. I explained the party situation and asked what documentation I needed to modify custody. Jeffrey said I needed evidence of a pattern of negligence or endangerment, not just a single incident. He said to keep records of everything, date and time stamp all communications, save all texts and emails, and document any concerning behavior. He also suggested I reach out to Natalie's school and ask to be notified of any issues since I was still listed as a parent with legal custody. I told him I'd already done that, and he said good, keep doing it. The more evidence I had that Derek and Vanessa weren't adequately supervising and supporting Natalie, the stronger my case would be if I needed to fight. Monday morning, the school called again. Natalie had arrived late and gone directly to the nurse's office complaining of a headache. The nurse asked if she'd eaten breakfast, and Natalie said no, because nobody had been home to make her anything, and she'd slept through her alarm. The nurse gave her crackers and water and asked if this was a pattern, and Natalie apparently started crying and said she missed living with her dad because he always made sure she ate breakfast and got to school on time. The nurse called me to see if I could provide any context about changes in Natalie's home situation. I explained the custody modification and said I'd been concerned about Natalie's well-being, but my hands were legally tied unless evidence emerged of neglect. The nurse said she'd document the conversation and keep me updated. That evening, Natalie called me from Vanessa's number. She said Derek had found out she'd told the school nurse she missed living with me, and he'd been really angry. He'd said she was being manipulative and ungrateful, and if she wanted to live in a tiny apartment eating cereal for breakfast, instead of living in a beautiful home with every advantage, then maybe she should think about what that said about her character. He'd said she was trying to make him look bad, because she couldn't handle being held accountable for her choices. She'd tried to explain she'd just been hungry and emotional, but he'd said she clearly wasn't mature enough to understand the opportunities she was being given. Then he'd taken her phone again and said she'd get it back when she'd learned to appreciate what she had. I asked Natalie if her mother had been present during this conversation, and she said yes, but Mom hadn't said anything. She'd just stood there while Derek lectured Natalie about gratitude and respect and maturity. I asked if I could speak to Vanessa, and Natalie said Derek wouldn't allow it because he said I was a negative influence who undermined their parenting. I told Natalie that wasn't true and asked if she felt safe. She said yes physically, but she felt constantly on edge like she was walking on eggshells waiting for Derek to find something else to criticize. I told her I was documenting everything and working on solutions, but in the meantime, she should focus on school and taking care of herself. She said she'd try, and she had to go because Derek was calling her for dinner. Jeffrey called me 3 days later and said Vanessa's lawyer had reached out. Apparently Derek wanted to formally adopt Natalie, and they were asking if I'd be willing to terminate my parental rights voluntarily. Jeffrey had told them absolutely not, but they'd pushed back, saying Natalie had expressed desire for Derek to be her legal father, and they wanted to honor her wishes. Jeffrey asked if I wanted him to respond in writing, making my position unequivocally clear, and I said yes. Send the strongest possible language refusing any termination of rights. Jeffrey said he'd draft something, and also mentioned the concerning patterns we'd been documenting. He said Vanessa's lawyer wouldn't like the implication that Derek's parenting was being scrutinized, but it would put them on notice that I was paying attention. 2 weeks passed with minimal contact from Natalie. She sent brief texts saying she was fine and busy with school. Her grades continued to decline according to the parent portal. More missing assignments, notes from teachers requesting parent conferences. I reached out to schedule meetings, but was told Vanessa had requested all communications go through her as primary custodial parent. I responded through the school system stating I retained legal custody and requested to be included in all conferences. The school counselor called me directly and said Natalie had been sent to her office twice in the past week for behavioral issues, once for sleeping in class and once for arguing with a teacher. This was completely out of character for Natalie, and the counselor was concerned. I explained the custody situation and recent changes. The counselor said she'd document our conversation and recommended family counseling. I said I'd been suggesting that for months, but Vanessa and Derek refused. The breaking point came 6 weeks after Thanksgiving. I got a call at 2 a.m. from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was Natalie's father. I said yes, and she identified herself as a police officer. My heart stopped. She said Natalie was safe, but she'd been found walking alone on a highway access road at 1:30 in the morning. A patrol officer had stopped to check on her, and Natalie had said she'd run away from home and was trying to get to my apartment, but didn't know the exact way. The officer had brought her to the station, and Natalie had given them my number. They'd also contacted Vanessa, who was on her way. I said I'd be there in 15 minutes. When I arrived at the police station, Natalie was sitting in a small room with a female officer who was giving her hot chocolate. Her eyes were red from crying, and she had a small cut on her hand. She saw me and started sobbing, and I held her while she cried into my shoulder. The officer explained they'd found Natalie about 3 miles from Derek's house, walking along the access road with no jacket, despite near-freezing temperatures. She'd been carrying a backpack with some clothes and her school laptop. When asked why she'd run away, she'd said she couldn't live in that house anymore. She'd tried to call me, but Derek had her phone locked in his office, so she'd waited until everyone was asleep and left through her bedroom window. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later with Derek. She looked panicked and rushed to Natalie asking if she was okay and what had happened. Derek looked furious. He demanded to know why the police had called me before discussing the situation with him as Natalie's stepfather and primary household authority. The officer said they'd called the numbers Natalie provided, and I was listed as her father with legal custody. Derek said the custody arrangement had been modified, and I was just weekend visitation now. The officer said that might be true for physical custody, but legal custody required court orders, and according to their records, I still had equal legal standing. Derek's jaw tightened, and he said this was a family matter that didn't require police involvement. The officer asked Natalie directly if she felt safe going home with her mother and Derek. Natalie looked at me with pleading eyes and said she wanted to stay with me. Vanessa said that wasn't an option. Natalie lived with them now and she needed to come home. The officer said, given the circumstances and Natalie's clear preference, they weren't going to force her to return tonight. She suggested Natalie stay with me and the parents work out arrangements in the morning when everyone was calmer. Derek started to argue, but the officer cut him off and said the alternative was getting child services involved to do a welfare check. Derek went silent. Vanessa asked to speak to me privately. We stepped into the hallway, and Vanessa immediately started crying. She said everything had spiraled out of control, and she didn't know how to fix it. Derek had become increasingly controlling and critical of Natalie. He'd implemented all these rules about respect and gratitude and mature behavior that were impossible for a 14-year-old to consistently meet. He took her phone away constantly as punishment. He monitored everything she did and questioned her choices and made her feel stupid and ungrateful. Vanessa had tried to intervene, but Derek would say she was being too soft, and Natalie needed firm guidance to reach her potential. Vanessa admitted she'd been afraid to push back too hard because their relationship was already strained, and she didn't want to lose Derek. I asked if she was seriously telling me she'd chosen her relationship with Derek over her daughter's well-being. Vanessa said it wasn't that simple. Derek provided stability and financial security she couldn't maintain alone. I said she'd provided just fine before Derek came along, and if he was psychologically abusing our daughter, then financial security meant nothing. Vanessa said abuse was a strong word, and Derek was just strict. I told her strict was having rules with consistent enforcement, abuse was creating impossible standards and punishing failures while isolating the victim from support systems. I said Derek had systematically alienated Natalie from me while presenting himself as her savior, and then revealed his true controlling nature once she was trapped in his house. Vanessa looked stricken and said she'd made a terrible mistake. I told Vanessa I was taking Natalie home with me tonight, and tomorrow we were filing emergency custody modification. If she wanted to fight me, she could, but I had 6 weeks of documentation showing Derek's escalating control and Natalie's deteriorating welfare under their supervision. I had school records, nurse reports, police reports, and my daughter climbing out a window at 1 in the morning to escape her stepfather. No judge would force Natalie to return to that environment. Vanessa said she wouldn't fight me. She agreed Natalie should live with me primarily. She said she needed time to figure out her situation with Derek, but right now, Natalie's safety was the priority. I said I appreciated that and suggested she think carefully about whether Derek was someone she wanted in her life at all. I drove Natalie back to my apartment while she sat silently in the passenger seat. When we got inside, she said she was sorry for everything she'd said at Thanksgiving. She said Derek had convinced her I was holding her back and he'd support her in ways I couldn't. But once she lived there full time, everything changed. He became critical and controlling. Nothing she did was good enough. He'd comment on her weight and her clothes and her friends and her interests. He'd say she was wasting her potential by being lazy or unfocused or immature. He monitored her phone and her computer and her conversations. He took away privileges for minor infractions and added new rules constantly. She'd felt like a prisoner in that house, and tonight she'd just snapped and couldn't take it anymore. I told Natalie that none of this was her fault. Derek had manipulated her by presenting a false version of himself, designed to appeal to a teenager who wanted more freedom and fewer rules. Once he had her isolated in his house, he'd revealed who he really was, a controlling man who saw relationships as opportunities to exert power. I said I'd never blame her for falling for his act, because he'd fooled her mother too, and adults were supposed to be better at seeing through manipulation. I told her she was brave for leaving and calling for help, and I was proud of her for trusting her instincts that something was wrong. She hugged me and said she'd missed me so much and missed our life before Derek. I said we'd get that life back starting now. Monday morning, Jeffrey filed emergency custody modification based on Natalie's welfare concerns. We included documentation of declining grades, school absences, concerning behaviors reported by school staff, the unsupervised party incident, and the police report from Friday night. The judge granted temporary primary custody to me, pending a full hearing. Vanessa's lawyer didn't contest it. Derek apparently wanted to fight, but Vanessa refused to support his position. The school was notified of the custody change, and I resumed being primary contact for all communications. Natalie's teachers expressed relief that someone was finally responding to their concerns. The first week back, Natalie slept until noon on Saturday and Sunday, catching up on months of sleep deprivation from Derek's lack of enforced bedtime and her anxiety-driven insomnia. We reinstated her homework routine at the kitchen table where I could help if she got stuck. We meal planned together and cooked dinners, and she actually ate vegetables without complaint. Her curfew returned along with consistent rules about screen time and chores. She didn't fight any of it. She seemed relieved to have structure again, to know what was expected and what consequences would follow if she didn't meet those expectations. She said living with Derek had been exhausting because the rules changed constantly based on his mood, and she never knew if she'd be praised or punished for the same behavior. 2 weeks after the custody change, Natalie's algebra teacher emailed me. Natalie had turned in all her missing work and scored a 90 on her most recent test. Whatever had changed at home was clearly helping her focus again. Her other teachers sent similar updates. She was participating in class, completing assignments, engaging with material. The school counselor asked to meet with Natalie weekly to process the trauma of living with Derek, and Natalie agreed. She said talking to someone neutral helped her understand that Derek's behavior wasn't normal parenting, and she hadn't deserved the constant criticism and control. Vanessa asked to meet with me 1 month after Natalie moved back. We met at a coffee shop near my apartment, and she looked different, smaller somehow. She said she'd asked Derek to move out while she figured out what she wanted. Living in that house alone had forced her to confront what their relationship actually was. Derek had controlled everything, the finances, the schedule, the social calendar, the parenting decisions. She'd gradually handed over her autonomy thinking his confidence meant he knew better. She'd watched him do the same thing to Natalie, systematically breaking down her confidence and independence while presenting it as guidance and high expectations. Vanessa said she'd filed for divorce and was in therapy trying to understand how she'd let things get so bad. I told Vanessa I appreciated her honesty and I was glad she was getting help. I asked what she wanted regarding Natalie, and she said she wanted to rebuild their relationship slowly. She suggested weekly dinners, just the two of them, where Natalie could see her mother without Derek's presence contaminating everything. She said she understood it would take time for Natalie to trust her again after Vanessa had chosen Derek over her. I said that sounded reasonable, and I'd discuss it with Natalie. Vanessa thanked me for not making this harder than it had to be, and for documenting everything even when it looked like I was just letting Natalie go. She said she understood now what I'd been doing, giving Natalie enough rope to see the truth herself, instead of forcing her to choose. The permanent custody hearing happened 3 months after Thanksgiving. Jeffrey presented our documentation, and the judge reviewed everything carefully. Derek's lawyer tried to argue that the issues had been isolated incidents, and Derek had only wanted the best for Natalie. The judge asked Derek directly why he'd dropped a 14-year-old at an unsupervised party without checking on adult presence. Derek said he'd trusted Natalie to handle herself maturely. The judge asked why he'd taken her phone away before doing so, eliminating her ability to contact him. Derek said he'd forgotten. The judge asked why he'd consistently ignored communications from school about Natalie's declining performance. Derek said he'd been teaching her accountability by not rescuing her from natural consequences. The judge asked why those natural consequences had resulted in her running away in the middle of the night. Derek had no answer. The judge granted me primary physical and legal custody, with Vanessa having alternating weekends and one weeknight dinner. Derek was granted no custody or visitation rights, as he had no legal relationship to Natalie, and she'd expressed clear preference not to see him. The judge noted that Derek's parenting approach had been psychologically harmful and his controlling behavior had warranted intervention. She commended me for documenting concerns while allowing the situation to unfold naturally, rather than forcing an adversarial custody battle that would have traumatized Natalie further. She said sometimes the best parenting meant trusting a child to recognize toxicity themselves rather than trying to convince them through argument. I thanked her and left the courthouse with Natalie holding my hand. 6 months later, Natalie wrote an essay for her English class about learning to recognize manipulation. She wrote about Derek's initial charm and promises, how he'd positioned himself as the parent who understood her and supported her dreams. She wrote about the gradual shift once she moved in, the escalating control disguised as high expectations, the constant criticism framed as pushing her toward excellence. She wrote about the isolation, as he'd systematically cut her off from me while making her dependent on his approval. She wrote about the moment she'd realized she needed to escape and the terror of climbing out her window but the greater terror of staying. She wrote about learning that real love meant structure and boundaries and someone who said no when you needed to hear it, not someone who promised everything, then took it all away. Her teacher gave her an A and asked if she'd be willing to read it to the class. Natalie asked me first if I'd be okay with her sharing our story publicly, and I said of course, her experience was hers to tell. She read it to her class, and afterward 3 other students approached her privately and said they'd experienced similar situations with step-parents or parents' partners. They thanked her for putting words to something they'd struggled to articulate. Natalie came home that day and said she wanted to volunteer with an organization that supported kids going through custody issues or dealing with toxic parent figures. I helped her find a youth advocacy group that trained teen mentors, and she started attending their workshops. Vanessa's divorce from Derek finalized around the same time. She'd lost money in the settlement because Derek had been strategic about protecting his assets, but she said the freedom was worth more than any financial security. She got an apartment near mine, something modest she could afford on her pharmaceutical sales salary. She furnished it gradually and started rebuilding her life without Derek's influence. Her weekly dinners with Natalie slowly extended to weekend visits, once Natalie felt safe spending the night. They went to therapy together to process everything that had happened and work on rebuilding trust. It was slow and sometimes painful, but Vanessa showed up consistently and took accountability for her choices, and gradually, Natalie started to forgive her. Derek tried to reach out to Natalie through social media multiple times. She blocked him immediately. He sent letters to my apartment addressed to her, and I saved them unopened in a file. He showed up at her school once, and the administration called police to escort him off campus. He posted on social media about parental alienation and being denied access to a child he'd tried to help. Natalie's friends sent her screenshots, and she just shook her head. She said Derek would never accept that he was the problem because people like him never did. They always positioned themselves as victims when they faced consequences for their behavior. She said she felt sorry for whoever he manipulated next. A year after Thanksgiving, Natalie asked if we could host the holiday at our apartment. My parents and sister and her family came over, and we crowded around a table that was slightly too small, but nobody cared. Vanessa came too at Natalie's invitation and fit into our gathering like she'd always been there. We went around the table saying what we were grateful for, and when it was Natalie's turn, she looked at me and said she was grateful for a dad who loved her enough to let her make mistakes and learn from them. She said she was grateful I'd documented everything quietly while trusting her to figure out the truth. She said she was grateful I'd never said I told you so, even though I'd absolutely told her so. Everyone laughed and my mother cried, and Natalie came over and hugged me while dessert was being served. After everyone left and Natalie was in her room doing homework, I sat on the couch thinking about the past year. The gamble I'd taken by letting her go to Derek's house had nearly broken both of us. There had been nights I'd lain awake terrified I'd made the wrong choice, that Derek would do permanent damage before Natalie saw through him. But forcing her to stay would have made me the enemy and Derek the misunderstood hero in her narrative. By stepping back, I'd given her space to experience the reality of his control and manipulation without my interference clouding her judgment. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.